Daniel Reed adjusted the stiff collar of his dress uniform, the synthetic fabric catching at his neck as he tried to focus on the looming ceremony ahead. His team had spent weeks preparing for this moment, a first-contact summit with the Askani, a reclusive alien race known for their breathtakingly intricate technology and strict adherence to protocol. As the doors to the Great Hall slid open, Daniel found himself stepping into a space like nothing he had ever seen. An enormous chamber bathed in an otherworldly, pulsing light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, shifting subtly as if breathing. Around him, his colleagues were clearly awestruck, their movements stiff and uncertain. "So, this is it," muttered Lieutenant Max Holmes, his usual humor buried beneath a layer of nerves. Holmes was the team's engineer and one of Daniel's closest confidants. He adjusted his visor, taking in the room's opulence. "I feel like I should have worn a tuxedo instead of this tin can." Daniel smirked slightly. "If you were wearing a tux, you'd still be complaining. Just try not to knock over any alien relics." "You mean like this one?" Holmes reached toward a glimmering crystalline object on a nearby pedestal, pulling his hand back quickly when Daniel gave him a warning look. "Relax, Captain. I'll behave." The hall was gradually filling with representatives from other species who had been invited to the summit. Daniel counted at least 5 distinct alien delegations, each with unique physical traits and ceremonial attire. Some had sinuous, flowing garments that shimmered like water. Others wore what appeared to be armor formed of living coral. It was overwhelming, and Daniel felt an unwelcome flash of doubt. Had humanity truly earned a seat at this table? "Captain Reed," came a gentle, melodic voice from behind him. Daniel turned to see a tall figure dressed in robes of silver and blue. The alien's pale, angular face was framed by hair that seemed to drift weightlessly, as if underwater. "I am Overseer Lathan, your guide for the evening." "It's an honor to be here, Overseer," Daniel replied, inclining his head slightly. He glanced at Holmes, who mimicked the gesture with a touch less grace. "Please follow me. The council chamber is this way," Lathan said, gesturing toward a shimmering archway. Daniel and his team followed, their boots clicking softly against the smooth, luminous floor. As they passed through the arch, they entered a smaller, more intimate room dominated by a massive circular table. At its center floated a holographic display of the galaxy, its vibrant colors shifting as if alive. Daniel couldn't help but be impressed, though he kept his expression neutral. At the far end of the table stood another Askani, this one younger, more striking, with a commanding presence that made even Lathan's grace seem subdued. Her golden eyes fixed on Daniel with a curious intensity. "Princess Era," Lathan said softly. "This is Captain Daniel Reed, the representative of humanity." Era inclined her head in acknowledgement, her gaze never leaving Daniel. "Captain Reed, I have heard much about your people." Daniel wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a warning. "I hope you've heard good things, Your Highness." "Some," she replied, a faint smile touching her lips, "and some less so. Your species has a reputation for boldness, Captain. I look forward to seeing if it is deserved." Holmes cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "We just want to make a good impression," he said. Era's smile widened slightly, as if she found his nervousness amusing. "And a good impression you have made, Lieutenant, for now." Daniel shot Holmes a look, and his friend fell silent, his cheeks coloring. Era gestured toward the table. "Please sit. We have much to discuss, and our time is limited." Daniel and Holmes took their seats, joining the other representatives from various worlds. The negotiations began in earnest, with discussions ranging from trade agreements to joint exploration initiatives. The Askani were meticulous in their demands, insisting on clear terms and no ambiguity. Era spoke often, her voice calm and measured, but Daniel noticed how she occasionally glanced his way, as if studying him. When the session finally adjourned, Daniel and Holmes found themselves lingering near the holographic galaxy map. The room was empty except for the two of them and Era, who approached them quietly. "Captain," she said, her tone softer than before, I find myself intrigued by humanity's unique perspective. Perhaps you would be willing to share more of your thoughts in a less formal setting. Daniel raised an eyebrow. A less formal setting? Era nodded. There are gardens here on Ascaris Prime that offer solitude. I would value your insights. Daniel hesitated. He knew how delicate these negotiations were, and the last thing he wanted was to overstep. But there was something in Era's eyes that suggested genuine curiosity. All right, he said finally. I'd be happy to. Holmes muttered under his breath. Good luck, Captain. Before excusing himself, leaving Daniel alone with Era. As they left the chamber, Daniel felt the weight of the mission pressing down on him. But he also felt a flicker of something unexpected. An opportunity to learn not just about the Ascani, but about their enigmatic princess. Chapter 2. A Starlit Encounter. The Ascaris Gardens were a mesmerizing labyrinth of glowing flora and gentle, trickling streams. Daniel had never seen anything like it. He wandered along a quiet path, faintly glowing tendrils of plants brushing against his uniform as though curious about his presence. The air carried a faint, sweet scent that seemed to sharpen his thoughts. He had meant to return to his quarters after the summit, but the surreal beauty of the gardens pulled him in. As he turned a corner, he nearly collided with Era. The princess seemed as startled as he was, her golden eyes widening before she quickly composed herself. Captain Reed, she said, a faint smile on her lips. I see you've discovered one of our planet's hidden treasures. Your Highness, he replied, taking a step back. I didn't mean to intrude. I was just exploring, she finished, gesturing for him to walk beside her. It's quite all right. These gardens were made to be enjoyed. Besides, I'd hoped I might run into you again. Daniel hesitated before falling into step with her. You were hoping to see me? Is that so surprising? She asked, glancing at him. You're different from the others. He shrugged. I'm not sure what you mean by different. Many of the others who come here from both our worlds are more concerned with maintaining appearances. They say the right words, but their hearts aren't in it. You seem genuine, honest. Daniel wasn't used to receiving compliments from alien royalty. I'm just doing my job, Your Highness. Please, she said, cutting him off. Call me Era. I grow tired of all the formalities. He nodded, though it still felt strange to address her so informally. All right, Era, and call me Daniel. They walked for a moment in silence, the gentle light of the plants reflecting off her silken robes. She stopped near a small pool, where bioluminescent fish glided beneath the surface. Do you know what I admire about your people, Daniel? He shook his head. Not a clue. Your curiosity, your drive to learn, to create, even when faced with uncertainty. My people value logic above all else. Sometimes that leaves little room for wonder. I envy the freedom your kind seems to embrace. Daniel studied her for a moment, unsure how to respond. It's not always as ideal as it sounds. Curiosity can lead to mistakes, sometimes big ones. Perhaps, she replied, dipping her fingers into the pool. The fish darted away, then cautiously returned. But I believe it's better than never questioning, never feeling more than duty. Don't you? Before he could answer, Holmes emerged from a nearby path. There you are, Captain, he said, raising a hand in greeting. He stopped short when he saw Era. Oh, Your Highness, I didn't mean to interrupt. It's quite all right, Era said, smiling faintly. Daniel and I were simply discussing differences in our cultures. Holmes looked between them, clearly trying to gauge the situation. I was just going to see if you wanted to review tomorrow's schedule, Captain. Daniel glanced at Era, then back at Holmes. Sure, let's find a quiet spot. Right over here, Holmes said, motioning toward a bench beneath a canopy of glowing vines. As the three of them sat down, Era joined the conversation with surprising ease, asking Holmes about his role in the delegation and what he thought of Ascaris Prime. Honestly, Holmes said, rubbing the back of his neck. It's incredible. Your technology, your architecture, it's like something out of a dream. I've worked on advanced propulsion systems, but the way your ships move through space makes our methods look ancient. Era's smile grew warmer. It's refreshing to hear such candor. Perhaps one day we can share more than just admiration. Perhaps even knowledge. Holmes looked surprised but nodded eagerly. That'd be an honor. Daniel couldn't help but notice how easily Era engaged with Holmes. The princess's demeanor was far from the aloof, untouchable figure he'd expected. If anything, she seemed genuinely interested in both their perspectives. As the conversation continued, the group grew more comfortable. Holmes and Daniel recounted stories from their missions, drawing laughter from Era. Her laughter was softer than he expected, almost musical. It made her seem less alien and more relatable. When the hour grew late, Era rose gracefully. "I should return before I'm missed," she said, though there was no hint of regret in her voice. "Thank you for indulging my curiosity." "Any time," Daniel said, standing as well. Holmes quickly followed suit. "Rest well, Daniel," she said, giving him a lingering look. Then she turned and vanished into the softly glowing maze. Holmes let out a low whistle once she was out of sight. "She's something else." Daniel nodded, still feeling the weight of her gaze. "Yeah, she really is." Chapter 3: Forbidden Friendship. The chamber was vast, its curved walls inlaid with shimmering patterns that pulsed softly in shades of violet and silver. Daniel sat at a long crystalline table, trying to follow the Ascani delegates' discussion about a potential joint exploration project. He had prepared meticulously for this, but the Ascani's methodical way of speaking, interspersed with frequent pauses to consult glowing tablets, required all of his concentration. His teammate Holmes, seated beside him, scribbled notes furiously on his own tablet, his brow furrowed. "Do you have anything to add, Captain Reed?" Era's voice broke through the measured monotony of the proceedings. She leaned forward slightly, her golden eyes fixed on him. Daniel hesitated. "Only that we'd need to ensure compatibility with our current scanning technology. If we can exchange some initial data." "Excellent point," she interjected smoothly, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Perhaps we can arrange a small demonstration of our respective systems." He nodded. "That would help us identify potential obstacles early on." Holmes muttered under his breath, "Good save, Captain." The meeting adjourned shortly after. As the other delegates filtered out, Daniel noticed Era lingering near the table. Holmes must have noticed too, because he nudged Daniel's arm and whispered, "Looks like she wants to talk to you. I'll go update the team." "Sure," Daniel said, watching Holmes depart before turning to Era. "You wanted to discuss something, Your Highness?" "I wanted to thank you," she said, stepping closer. "Your perspective is refreshing. The Ascani Council rarely entertains ideas that differ from tradition. Your approach, your candor, is unusual." "Unusual in a bad way?" he asked, folding his arms. "Not at all. In fact, I find it admirable." She paused, then added, "And it's Era. Please, no more titles when we're speaking informally." "All right, Era," he said slowly, as if testing the sound of her name. "What's on your mind?" Her expression softened. "I'd like to learn more about your people, not just the formal reports and carefully curated presentations. I want to understand what drives you, what you value." "Why?" Daniel asked, his tone cautious. "Aren't the official briefings enough?" "They're enough for the council, but not for me. There's something compelling about humanity's willingness to face the unknown. It's not something we Ascani encourage, and I think that's why I'm so curious." Daniel leaned against the table's edge. "Well, we're an imperfect species. Maybe that's part of it, having to work around our flaws." "Flaws?" she repeated thoughtfully. "We Ascani rarely acknowledge ours. To admit imperfection is seen as a weakness." "Sometimes admitting it makes you stronger," he replied. Era tilted her head, studying him. "Perhaps you're right, but I'd like to see it for myself." He hesitated, then gestured toward the room's arched doorway. "I've got some time. Want to talk more about it now?" "I'd like that," she said, her smile returning. They walked side by side through the sprawling halls of the Ascani compound. It was late, and most of the corridors were deserted. The glowing panels dimmed to a soft lavender hue. "So," she began, "what drew you to your line of work? Representing humanity among alien species. Surely there are easier jobs." "Easier, sure," Daniel said, "but not as interesting. I always wanted to see what's out there. And I've always believed that the best way to learn is through direct experience." Era nodded. "That's something we Askani often avoid. Direct experience can be unpredictable." "Is that why your people keep to themselves so much?" he asked, glancing at her. "Partly," she admitted. "We value stability and order, but I've always felt there's something more to life than just following the established path." "That's one thing we humans understand," Daniel said. "We're constantly looking for something new, even when it gets us into trouble." Era smiled at that. "You don't fear the unknown?" "Not fear. Caution, maybe, but fear only holds you back." She was silent for a moment, then said, "I'd like to hear more about the challenges humanity has faced. Not just your successes, but the obstacles and failures. Those are often the most revealing." "Sure," Daniel said, "but only if you're willing to share the same about your people." "Agreed," she said, her golden eyes bright with curiosity. They continued talking as they walked through the quiet halls, their conversation punctuated by moments of laughter and reflection. By the time they returned to the main chamber, Daniel felt as though he had learned as much about Era as she had about him. Holmes was waiting there, tablet in hand. "Everything good?" he asked, looking between them. "Better than good," Daniel replied. "We're finally making progress." Holmes raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details. "Well, the team's ready whenever you are. We've got a lot to go over before tomorrow." Daniel glanced at Era, who gave him a subtle nod. "All right, let's get to it." As he and Holmes headed back to the human quarters, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. He didn't fully understand it yet, but he knew that his conversations with Era weren't just casual exchanges. They were opening a door to something entirely new. Chapter 4. The Warrior's Suspicion. The ornate council chamber buzzed with quiet activity. Daniel stood with his hands clasped behind his back, feeling the weight of the moment. At the other end of the long chamber, Era and her Askani advisor were engaged in a hushed discussion with several elders. Despite the distance, Daniel could feel her presence, as though the air between them carried a charge. She didn't look his way, but something in her posture seemed more tense than usual. Beside him, Holmes muttered, "The Askani don't look too thrilled today." Daniel glanced at his engineer. "They're not the only ones. What's on your mind?" Holmes lowered his voice. "That warrior guy, Varric or whatever, has been keeping an eye on you. And her." "Varric?" Daniel frowned. He'd seen the towering Askani warrior a few times, always standing a step behind Era during formal proceedings. His stoic demeanor gave little away, but now that Holmes mentioned it, Daniel remembered catching Varric's sharp, assessing glances whenever Era spoke directly to him. "Yeah," Holmes continued. "I saw him earlier. He was asking one of the guards about you, what your role is where you've been staying." "You don't think he's jealous?" Daniel asked dryly. "Hard to say. He doesn't exactly strike me as the type to get emotional." Holmes smirked. "Maybe not, but he's definitely the type to keep tabs on anyone he sees as a threat." Daniel looked back toward the council table. Era was still deep in conversation, her hands moving gracefully as she spoke. Her confidence was evident, but so was the undercurrent of pressure she must have felt. She was a leader, a symbol of her people's unity, and she was also navigating the delicate waters of her own personal freedom. It was no wonder Varric, her supposed betrothed, might feel uneasy about her newfound closeness to a human. "Let him watch," Daniel said, though his tone was cautious. "I'm not doing anything wrong." Holmes arched a brow. "Not yet. But if he gets the wrong idea, I'll handle it," Daniel cut in. "Let's focus on the next set of proposals." Holmes shrugged, but the tension between them lingered. They spent the next hour reviewing data and preparing for the upcoming negotiation sessions. As they worked, Daniel kept one ear tuned to the subtle movements of the chamber. When he finally looked up, Era was no longer there. Neither was Varric. Later, as Daniel walked alone through one of the palace corridors, he heard the soft hum of Ascani voices around a corner. He slowed his pace, not eavesdropping exactly, but allowing himself to listen. He recognized one of the voices immediately. Varric. Her attentions have shifted, Varric said, his deep, steady tone resonating even at a low volume. The human has distracted her. Princess Era's choices are her own, another voice replied, calmer but firm. You risk undermining her authority by pressing this matter. You think I don't see what's happening? Varric's voice darkened. She is bound to me. Her duty, our duty, is to uphold the unity of our people. If she chooses. Enough! The other voice interrupted sharply. You overstep your role. The council will decide what is best, not you. There was silence. Daniel, feeling a knot tighten in his chest, decided it was time to move. He turned the corner deliberately, his boots striking the floor with just enough force to announce his presence. Varric and the other Ascani stood at the far end of the hall. The other alien, a dignitary Daniel didn't recognize, gave a respectful nod and left without a word. Varric, however, stayed, his piercing gaze locked onto Daniel. Captain Reed, Varric said, his voice calm but with a distinct edge. A convenient coincidence. Not really, Daniel said. I was on my way to the main wing. Thought I'd see if anyone was around. Varric stepped closer, his imposing frame making Daniel instinctively st. Oing. Your presence disrupts her focus. With all due respect, that's not for you to decide, Daniel replied, choosing his words carefully. If the princess herself has concerns, she'll let me know. Varric's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing further. Instead, he turned and walked away, his long strides echoing down the corridor. Daniel watched him go, his pulse slightly elevated. He had expected scrutiny, but Varric's intensity felt more personal than professional. Wonderful, Daniel muttered to himself. Exactly what we need, internal drama. When he returned to the human delegation's quarters, Holmes was waiting. So, how'd it go? Daniel shook his head. Varric definitely knows something's up. We need to be careful. Holmes gave a low whistle. He's not going to make this easy, is he? Doesn't look that way, Daniel replied. But we're not going to let him intimidate us. We've got a job to do. And yet, as Daniel settled into his desk to review the next set of proposals, he couldn't shake the image of Varric's intense stare, or the subtle warning it carried. Chapter 5, Crossing the Line. Daniel stood by the edge of a crystalline reflecting pool, the faintly glowing water casting ripples of light onto the surrounding walls. He took a slow breath, glancing down at his reflection. These moments of quiet were rare, and he found himself wishing he could hold onto the calm for just a little longer. I thought I might find you here. Era's voice floated softly behind him. He turned to see her stepping lightly onto the smooth walkway that encircled the pool. She wore a simple, elegant gown that shimmered like the stars above, and as she approached, he could see a faint smile on her lips. Couldn't sleep either? Daniel asked, his tone lighter than he felt. Not with everything on my mind, she replied, stopping a few paces from him. I needed a moment away from the council chambers, the endless debates, the expectations. Daniel nodded. I know the feeling. He gestured to the bench near the water's edge. Want to sit? She hesitated for just a moment before lowering herself onto the bench, her gaze on the rippling water. This place is always beautiful at night, she said, her voice softer now. It feels separate from everything else. Sometimes you need that, Daniel said as he took a seat next to her. Just to think clearly. They sat in silence for a few moments. The only sound was the gentle hum of the Ascani flora surrounding them. Daniel could feel the tension she carried, the weight of responsibilities that were not entirely her own. Daniel, she said quietly, turning toward him, do you ever question the path you've chosen? All the time, he admitted without hesitation. But it's not about questioning whether it's the right path. It's about deciding if it's worth walking. And has it been? She asked, her golden eyes searching his face. He nodded slowly. So far. Even when it's tough, it feels like I'm doing something that matters. She smiled faintly, then looked down at her hands. I envy that certainty. I've spent so much of my life being told what I must do, who I must be, that I can't even tell if it's what I want. Daniel studied her for a moment. You're allowed to want something different, Era, even if it's not what everyone else expects. Her smile faded, and her eyes turned back to the pool. But what if the cost is too high? I guess that's something only you can answer, Daniel said softly. He hesitated, then added, You're not alone in this, though. I'm here, if you need someone to talk to. Her gaze met his again, and this time there was a vulnerability in her expression he hadn't seen before. Thank you, Daniel. That means more than you know. They sat quietly for a while longer, but the atmosphere between them had shifted. There was something unspoken lingering in the air, something that made the space between them feel both closer and more charged than before. Finally, Era stood, smoothing the fabric of her gown. I should return before anyone notices I'm gone, she said, though she didn't move right away. Daniel rose as well. Sure, I understand. She hesitated again, then stepped closer. I'm glad we talked, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Me too, Daniel replied. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, almost imperceptibly, Era reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. Daniel felt a warm jolt at the contact, and he turned his hand to let her fingers settle against his palm. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Daniel saw not just an Askani princess, but someone longing to break free from the role she had been forced into. Era seemed to sense the change too, because she didn't pull away. Daniel, she began, her voice unsteady. Before she could say more, footsteps echoed from a nearby corridor. Both of them stepped back instinctively the moment broken. Era glanced toward the sound, her expression guarded once more. I have to go, she said quickly, then turned and disappeared into the shadows. Daniel stood there for a moment, his hand still tingling from where hers had touched it. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was certain of one thing. Their connection had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Chapter 6. The Secret Exposed. The chamber was dimly lit, with only the soft glow of Askani panels casting pale light across the smooth surfaces. Daniel paced near the entrance, glancing now and then at the sleek doorway that led to the council's private meeting room. Holmes was seated on a low, transparent bench, tapping his fingers against his tablet. This is getting out of hand, Holmes muttered. I'm telling you, they're going to notice. They already have, Daniel replied quietly. He stopped pacing and leaned against the wall, arms crossed. It's just a matter of how they handle it. Holmes set the tablet down. And what about her? Is she willing to go along with this? Because if she's not, she is, Daniel said, cutting him off. She's not some puppet. She knows what she wants, and she's made her choice. Yeah, well, her choice could get us all thrown off this planet, Holmes said, his voice lower now. Or worse. Daniel looked at his friend, his expression firm. I know the risks, Max. I'm not dragging her into this. We're in this together. Holmes shook his head. You're playing with fire. Before Daniel could reply, the door slid open with a soft hiss. Era stepped out, her golden eyes scanning the corridor before she spotted Daniel. Her movements were quick but composed, as if she had rehearsed this moment in her mind. Daniel, she said, her voice calm but urgent. We need to talk. Right here? He asked, straightening up. No, she replied, glancing at Holmes. Somewhere more private. Holmes stood, holding up his hands. Fine, I'll go check on the team. Just be careful, all right? He left without another word, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Era gestured toward a side passage. Daniel followed her into a smaller, circular room lined with what looked like transparent panels displaying Askani star charts. The room felt intimate, the faint hum of the technology creating a subtle, soothing background sound. I overheard Varric speaking with the council. Era began once the door had closed behind them. He suspects. More than that, he knows. Daniel's chest tightened. How can he know? We've been careful. Careful isn't enough, she said, crossing her arms. He's been watching us, Daniel. He's seen the way we talk, the way we look at each other. I've tried to maintain appearances, but he's not a fool. Daniel let out a slow breath. What did he say? He hasn't gone to my father yet, but he will, Era said. And when he does, this will no longer be just our secret. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, trying to think. We can still fix this. If we keep our distance. No, Era interrupted, stepping closer. I'm not going to pretend anymore. I've had enough of that. But we need to decide what to do before he forces our hand. Daniel looked into her eyes and saw not fear, but determination. All right, he said. Then we need a plan. What if we talk to the council ourselves? Lay everything out, before Varric has the chance. Era shook her head. They'll side with him. Even if they don't like him, they'll see me breaking tradition as a threat. The council exists to preserve order, not to support change. Then what? Daniel asked. Do we run? Hide? I don't know, she admitted, her voice quieter now. But I do know that I can't keep pretending to be something I'm not. He stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. You won't have to. I'll stand by you whatever happens. Her gaze softened. You don't know what you're saying, Daniel. If they turn against us, you'll be seen as the outsider who corrupted their princess. They'll have every reason to expel you, possibly worse. I don't care, he said. If that's the price, I'll pay it. She looked at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. All right, but we need to be smart about this. We can't just let Varric dictate how this plays out. The sound of footsteps outside made them both tense. Era stepped back as the door slid open, revealing one of the Ascani attendants. The attendant bowed slightly. Princess, your presence is requested in the main chamber. Era's posture straightened. Tell them I'll be there shortly. The attendant nodded and left as silently as he had appeared. Daniel met her gaze. This isn't over. No, she said. It's just beginning. Chapter 7. The Ultimatum. Daniel stood at the far end of the council chamber, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. The air felt heavier than usual, and the light from the Ascani wall panels seemed dimmer, casting faint, shifting patterns on the smooth floor. Era stood nearby, her posture rigid as she faced the line of Ascani council members. Varric was on the opposite side of the room, his expression carved from stone. Princess Era, one of the council members began, his voice calm but laced with warning. This situation is unprecedented. Your actions have raised questions about your loyalty to your people and the sacred traditions that bind us. I am loyal to my people, Era replied, her tone steady but sharp. But loyalty does not mean blindly following tradition. It means doing what's best for all of us, even if that means questioning the path we've always walked. You speak of change, another council member interjected. But what you've done risks destabilizing the alliance we have built. We must consider the consequences of your relationship with this human. His gaze slid toward Daniel. Daniel stepped forward, his voice firm but respectful. If I may speak? The council exchanged glances before one elder gave a small nod. You may. Daniel squared his shoulders. I understand your concerns, but this isn't just about tradition or politics. Era and I have formed a bond built on mutual respect and understanding. What we've shared has helped me see the Ascani not as distant, unreachable figures, but as individuals with hopes and fears, just like us. Sentimentality is not enough to justify breaking centuries-old protocols, Varric said coldly, stepping closer. Princess Era's duty is to her people, not to her personal whims. Her actions jeopardize the stability we've worked so hard to maintain. Era turned to face him. You speak of duty, Varric, but your concern is not about stability. It's about control. You would rather I remain silent and compliant. simply because that is what is expected. Enough, the lead council member said, raising a hand. His piercing gaze shifted to Era. You have chosen a dangerous path. The council must decide if this relationship can be allowed to continue. Era stepped forward, her voice rising with conviction. If you truly believe in the principles we claim to uphold, mutual respect, understanding, and progress, then you cannot punish me for seeking a connection that embodies those ideals. To do so would contradict everything we stand for. Daniel watched as the council deliberated in hushed tones. He felt the tension between him and Varric, the warrior's unspoken challenge hanging heavy in the air. Despite the calm facade of the council members, he could tell that their decision would be more than a simple verdict. It would set a precedent for how the Askani viewed not only him, but humanity as a whole. After what felt like an eternity, the lead council member addressed them again. Princess Era, Captain Reed, the council will allow this bond to continue, but under strict conditions. It must remain private. There will be no public declarations, no formal recognition of your relationship. If you are discovered again, the council will have no choice but to end this arrangement, and the consequences will be severe. Era's expression softened, though the weight of the decision still hung over her. I accept these conditions. For now. Varric's lips thinned, his disappointment clear even if he remained silent. Daniel could feel the warrior's anger simmering just below the surface, but he knew better than to provoke him further. As the council members began to disperse, Era turned to Daniel. Let's go, she said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and resolve. He nodded, following her out of the chamber. Holmes was waiting for them down the hall, his expression curious and a little wary. How'd it go? We're not being exiled, Daniel said. That's something. Holmes raised an eyebrow. But? It's complicated, Era replied before Daniel could. The council agreed to let us be together, but only in secret. Any misstep could undo everything. Holmes gave a low whistle. That's a tightrope, all right, but I guess it's better than nothing. The three of them walked on in silence for a while. When they reached the quarters designated for the human delegation, Holmes left them alone, muttering something about catching up on reports. Era turned to Daniel. Thank you for standing up for me in there. I know it wasn't easy. He met her gaze. You didn't have to do it alone, and we'll figure out a way to make this work. For the first time that day, Era smiled. A small, genuine smile that brought warmth to the cold, tense atmosphere. I know we will, she said. They stood together for a moment longer before retreating to their respective rooms. The knowledge that their relationship now walked a thin line between acceptance and condemnation weighing heavily on their shoulders. Chapter 8. A New Path Forward. Daniel sat cross-legged on the soft grass of the Askani Gardens, the bioluminescent plants around him casting a cool glow. Era knelt beside him, her golden eyes reflecting the faint light. It had been a week since the council's decision, and while they had agreed to keep their relationship discreet, it felt strange to be so restricted after everything they'd endured together. Holmes strolled up, hands shoved in his pockets. How's the lovebirds' little meeting? He asked, though there was no edge to his tone. His smile was more amused than anything. Era glanced at Daniel, then back to Holmes. We were discussing our next steps. Next steps? Holmes arched a brow. You're not planning a great escape or anything, are you? Daniel shook his head. Not exactly, but we're trying to figure out how to keep this from becoming a constant balancing act. Yeah, well, don't let me stop you. I'll just stand over here and keep watch. Make sure no Askani guards come sniffing around, Holmes said, leaning casually against a nearby tree. Era chuckled softly, surprising even herself. Your friend has a curious sense of humor, Daniel. You get used to it, Daniel said with a small grin. But seriously, Era, what are we going to do? We can't keep tiptoeing around forever. She lowered her gaze, brushing her fingers lightly over one of the glowing leaves beside her. I don't have an easy answer. The council's conditions are clear. If we're discovered, everything could collapse. And yet, here we are, he said, his tone quieter. It's not exactly a great position to be in. Every conversation, Every moment. It's like we're constantly looking over our shoulders. Holmes chimed in from his post. You know, you could always pull the cultural exchange card. Tell them it's all part of diplomacy or something. Daniel turned back to him. Not sure that'd fly with the Ascani Council, Max. Hey, just throwing ideas out there, Holmes said. You two are the ones in the hot seat. Era sighed, looking back at Daniel. I wish I could promise you that things will get easier, but I've learned that promises mean little when circumstances are beyond our control. Daniel reached out, his hand brushing hers. We'll make it work, no matter what. She nodded, her expression softening. Thank you, Daniel, for staying, for not giving up. Holmes shifted his stance, pretending not to notice the exchange. Well, I hate to break the moment, but if you're serious about finding a way forward, you're going to need more than just quiet talks in a garden. What's the long-term plan? Era looked thoughtful. Perhaps it's not about proving anything to the council. Perhaps it's about showing the value of collaboration, demonstrating what we can achieve together, quietly, over time. Like building trust through actions instead of just words, Daniel said, nodding. If they see how well we work together, how we can solve problems they care about, it might soften their stance. Holmes crossed his arms. So you're thinking, play the long game? Exactly, Era replied. Start small. Let the council see how our partnership strengthens both our peoples without challenging the traditions they hold so dear. Sounds slow, Holmes said, but maybe it's the only way to keep you two from ending up in an Ascani detention center. Daniel smirked. You've got such a way with words, Max. Holmes grinned. That's why you keep me around, Captain. The three of them stood there for a while, the soft hum of the garden filling the silence. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a path, one they could walk together step by careful step.